Well, happy King Day to everybody. As Mike said, this is really a forum that we created back in September, like to dialogue and to have conversation. Um, Much of what I wanted to share has already been kind of touched on. I think we find ourselves at a really interesting moment as we celebrate King Day here in 2021. As was alluded to, we have just witnessed last week unprecedented event. You know, when I contrast the activities of last week at the Capitol with King and the March on Washington in August of 1963. I contrast that with the Black Lives Matter marches of this summer. Um, it gives us two stark contrasts about democracy in America. And those contrasts are one group of individuals, the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter, which is a modern expression and extension of that, the movements and the protests that have happened across the country were all movements in pushing for an inclusive democracy. How do we make the promises of democracy, of liberty, freedom, the pursuit of happiness? How do we ensure that availability for everybody? Contrast that with those who were marching for what I call an exclusive democracy. Those who were marching to nullify, to marginalize, to exclude the outcome of an election, primarily centered around. You know, they weren't protesting votes in Utah. They weren't protesting votes in Alabama. They were protesting against and wanted to disenfranchise Black and brown voters in Detroit, in Philadelphia, in Atlanta, in Milwaukee County. And I think that's just a real stark kind of contrast between where we've been and where we kind of find ourselves at today. And the brother alluded to earlier that there really does need to be a reimagining, a reevaluation of how we celebrate King Day. You know, you think about King Day, it's really been something that's been taken hostage. It's been taken hostage from the standpoint of we've turned it from a conversation, an assessment, an analysis about the democratic process, the inclusiveness of our society, to a day of service. We've kind of watered it down. We've made it something that doesn't hurt anybody's feelings, rather than an opportunity for us to do serious evaluation about where we find ourselves as a nation, as a society. You know, you can't figure out where you're going if you don't know where we are. If you put a destination in GPS, the first thing it's going to ask you is, where are you? And it's time for us, the conversation has started, and it needs to kind of continue the assessment about where we are. When King, he was just one of many who were speaking in Washington 57 years ago. And what folks don't realize is that march was really centered around an economic movement. It was a march for jobs. It was really centered around economic issues, civil rights being reflected through the lens of economic issues. And when Dr. King talked about a bad check, I just want to read a couple of words that he said in that speech, because I think it's really, really relevant to what is it that we are trying to accomplish today. That we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, They were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is corrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity to this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and security and justice. And when you think about it, 57 years ago, we made some great strides. They're talking about the accomplishments. We've made some great strides. There are some who would characterize the strides that were made in the late 60s, early 70s as part of the second Reconstruction. For those who are historians, you remember the first Reconstruction after the Civil War is what gave us the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which was alluded to earlier. In the second Reconstruction, shortly after King makes this notable speech in 1964, 1 year later, we get the Civil Rights Act, which bans discrimination based upon race, religion, national origins. It establishes the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. Then in 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act, which attempts to ensure the franchisement of black voters into the American democracy. 1968, we get the Fair Housing Act. And then all through the 70s, we get the movement toward affirmative action programs, the integration of schools and communities. I remember myself, I was 7 years old and I was part of the busing program here in the city of Allentown. I was 7 years old and I was put on a bus one day and taken to a school and told to get off the bus. And I was the only black student in an all-white school at 7 years old. So we've made progress. There has been progress that's been made. In 1963, there were 1,400 black elected officials nationwide. 1,400. That's even surprising, even for 1963. Today, there are over 10,500 black elected officials across the country. We've witnessed in our lifetime something that if many of us, especially us old heads, I'm in the baby boomer generation, many of us thought we'd never see. We witnessed the election and the swearing in and the voting in for 2 terms of America's first black president in Barack Obama. We are now going to witness shortly the swearing in of America's first black and Indian vice president. On an economic standpoint, we've watched the rise of the black entrepreneur. We've watched the rise of the black mogul, the billionaire athletes, and the rise of black ownership of business. So we can say that there's been progress that's been made, that the dream is in pursuit. But the reality, though, that progress doesn't really tell the true story, because there's far too many people who are benefiting and receiving from that progress. When we think about the reality of where the black community finds itself in 2021, when you think about the wealth gap, we are still white wealth, white family income and wealth is still 13 times larger than black folk. When you look at the incarceration rate, we are still disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. When we look at the war on drugs and policing techniques, we are still disproportionately negatively impacted and targeted by law enforcement. When you think about child poverty, access to healthcare, one of the things that the coronavirus has revealed for all of us, has heightened the disparity that has already existed in terms of black folk having access to quality healthcare, and the subsequent economic impact of COVID has devastated a community that has already been far behind economically. When we think about the unemployment rate, ours is still twice that of our less melanin brothers and sisters, our white folks. When you look at the educational systems that we operate and live in, and that our kids need to be successful, to pursue the American dream, to develop skills and abilities that they can market out there into the world, to become self-sufficient. Just right here in the Lehigh Valley, if you think about the Allentown School District, when you look at a national study that was done, it is one of the top 10 underfunded school districts in the entire nation. What we're living with today is the reality of we have Brown versus the Board of Education, that landmark Supreme Court that said that you cannot have, it's unconstitutional to have an educational system that is separate based upon race. Well, what we have today is we still have separate and unequal educational systems. They're no longer based primarily on race, though race is a huge determining factor, but it's based upon how we fund education today. Allentown School District has some 18,000 young people, majority black and brown. How are they going to be able to prepare themselves to be contributing citizens in a 21st century economy that's more and more moving towards knowledge-based? Housing. And we can go on and on and on in terms of what Dr. King was specifically addressing in the March on Washington, and where we specifically find ourselves today. One of the things that King talked about in one of his later speeches, when talking about the condition of black folk, he talked about our economic insecurity and discrimination, and he said that it's almost as if we were exiles in our own land, placed on an economic island, marooned with no way off. That's still very much the case for far too many black and brown folks. And he emphasized this in 1965. He talked about the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism. And when you think about those, the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism, those giant triplets are standing strong, and they are the major barrier and challenges that we are confronting today. He talked about this ideal, this false ideal in America about having socialism for the rich, but rugged individualism for the poor. This idea that we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. So I think it's so appropriate for us, 2021, to begin the process of reimagining what the celebration of Dr. King's life and legacy should really be about. Move away from the passivity of a day of service that makes our less melanin brothers and sisters a lot more comfortable, and to really put front and center what the center of his mission really was. And that was to confront the underlying racial white supremacy that has been the bedrock and the driving engine of this nation since 1619. You see, right now we find ourselves in the midst of two pandemics as a nation. We have the pandemic of COVID-19 that's been with us for a little over a year. And it's been the failure of this administration and the attitude of this administration that has made this pandemic of COVID-19 worse. And we're approaching 400,000 dead, and they say by the end of February it's going to be 500,000 dead. But there's a second pandemic that's been with us since 1619, and that is the pandemic of racism, of white supremacy, of the underlying American ideal that white folk matter more than other folk. That's the legacy of Dr. King, to confront that underlying lie that we've told ourselves about the democratic view of our nation. And on King Day, if we can't be honest about that lie, if we can't confront that lie, if we can't evaluate the progress of our society about that lie, then we're in trouble. Because here's what the sobering reality for us is. White supremacy, racism, white nationalism, it was always seen as something that was on the fringe, and that was something that we as people of color really need to be most concerned about. Well, the events of last week, the events at the Capitol, have now sobered the entire nation to understand this. Just like in the Civil War was fought to preserve the ideal of white supremacy. That's the underlying reason why the Civil War was fought. And now we're on the verge of another civil war. Why? Because those folks who stormed the Capitol, those white national terrorists, what was the underlying, driving, motivating theme, value system, and philosophy? This is our country. Our voice matters, not anybody else's voice matters. And if the voice of others changes an election outcome, we are going to overthrow that voice, because this is our country and our voice matters. And now that voice of white supremacy has put the security and the stability of our entire democracy. It is now threatening white folk. It is now threatening the very vehicle by which it has found expression over the course of our history as a nation. And now we can't ignore it any longer. We have to confront it, and we have to deal with it. That's the legacy that we find ourselves with here in 2021 as we celebrate the life, the legacy of Dr. King. Progress has been made, absolutely. But the progress that has been made has been under threat. The rollback, as was mentioned earlier, of voting rights, the rollback of affirmative action programs, initiatives, and the value system of inclusion. They're all under threat. And now, more than ever, rather than being passive observers from the sidelines, it's incumbent upon all of us to become more actively engaged in the process.